All right, to continue, let's start examining some of the characteristics of a slave narrative. And the items on this screen are not necessarily in chronological order and how they might appear in the narrative. And we're talking about characteristics of the narrative, not of a slave's life. Okay, so these are how they appear in the actual texts that were written. These are some of the things that appear. Okay. The narrator often, and again, this might have been added just as a kind of way of signaling to the reader this is a slave narrative, so that there's a pattern of things that they're expecting to see when they read the narrative. But what seems to occur in many of the more popularized narratives is that as a young child, the slave may not even have realized they were a slave, but something horrific or something traumatic happens to awaken them from their state of innocence and to be thrust into the horror of slavery itself. So that's what what this first one means here. That sounds kind of strange the way it's stated, but that's what they're talking about. They're are often rebels in some ways. They're trying to rebel against their situations, and they're not able to either submit to slavery or to resist it. They're not in a position to actually resist the slavery. So that puts them in sort of a kind of a tension for the slave. Wanting to escape versus the risks of escaping. And some of them have families, and what to do with the families, and how would they take care of them, and what sort of things could be worse than slavery if they would try to escape. Sometimes they see themselves as just a symbol to represent all the other oppressed peoples, whether oppressed through slavery or otherwise, a symbol that could be identified with. And often you'll see as the same thing that happened with Rowlandson, so this might be added after the fact, that the narrator tends to grow in moral and spiritual strength. So they suffer and they undergo a lot of torment, but they come out the other end a stronger and more spiritual person. All right. This pattern is sort of more than we probably need at this point. And when we talk about a mythological structure, we're talking about the typical pattern of these narratives, not that this has been made up or it's a myth or anything like that. So if you're interested in these next few slides, by all means read them, but I'm not going to cover them here. I just left them for you. So let's look at the stages of a slave narrative. Again, we talked about that descent from a state of innocence, as a child often, into recognition of an ever dehumanizing state. So for some of the slave narratives, the slave's life gets worse and worse and worse and worse. But at the same time, they're gaining some self-reliance, they're learning some skills, sometimes literacy, that will help them escape later. There's often a sort of a dark night of the soul where the narrator says, I just can't take it anymore. I can't take the fighting to be free. I can't see these horrible things happening. Why has God deserted me? That's sort of what they call here a spiritual bottoming out. But often afterwards, their strength is resolved, and with Douglas here is being referenced, he has a fight with Covey, and that sort of cements his resolve to do something. I'm going to escape this. And flight. They finally escape. Or they are set free, but more often it's the narratives they escape. We'll also see quite a number of motifs occurring over and over in different slave narratives, and there's hundreds of these, and I gave you a couple of links to those, both published narratives and some recordings of former slaves that I think you'd find really interesting. But we see these kind of motifs, these themes occurring over and over. The physical and emotional abuses of slavery, the hypocrisy and inconstancy of the white population, particularly the owners. Sometimes their hopes are raised. Oh, we'll do this for you, we'll do that for you, and then the rug is pulled out from them. Someone's going to help them escape, and then it falls through. They take their money. They're sometimes even taken advantage of by their own family and friends. people who they think are going to help them that do not, black and white. There's often a quest for literacy, as I mentioned earlier, a quest for freedom, and those the freedom part, the escape is often a significant part of the story, and then sometimes it's just quickly mentioned, I escaped, I was free. So it just depends on the story, the narrator's story, and how it's being put together. We sometimes hear about the stories of those who have gone before this particular narrative, in how they succeeded and how they failed. And there's often a direct appeal to the audience, so where the narrative may wait, it's like it would be like somebody on stage turning around and talking to the audience. You'll see that same sort of thing happen in a slave narrative, where they'll interrupt the story to speak to the audience, to the reader, and appeal for help, justice, an end to slavery, that sort of thing. And there's details of the loss of family members and family ties and that sort of thing. All right, so the end of this is just a few of these other slave narratives that are available. All of them are really interesting, but those are the characteristics and the patterns and the motifs that you're going to look at for this week's activity.